Kia ora koutou katoa. This week we've celebrated St Valentine's Day. Valentine was an early Christian saint from the period before the Christianization of Rome. He practiced and shared his faith at a time when it could potentially get you killed. Much is unknown about St Valentine, and there's all sorts of stories you can read. But I'll tell you some of the legends. One of the legends is that he came to the attention of Rome's Emperor Claudius II because he was performing unsanctioned and unapproved marriages. And it's from these marriages that he became known as the patron saint of love. In some accounts, those marriages were unsanctioned because they were between Christians and non-Christians. Note this restriction is not peculiar to Roman days. When I was ordained in the 1980s, the Anglican Church's requirement for me to officiate at a wedding was that both parties were baptized. Most clergy, though, who I knew in a Valentinian spirit, you might say, just somehow forgot to ask that question at the pre-wedding interview. I suspect Presbyterian clergy had a similar restriction, which also similarly most forgot to ask. Such church laws and regulations are embarrassingly antiquated and frankly unethical. What I mean by unethical is that I think there should be a very high bar for why a minister could refuse to marry a couple. Of the hundreds, maybe thousands of weddings I've taken over 40 years, I've only ever refused one couple, and they, after seeing a marriage counsellor, which I funded, made that decision themselves. The history of marriage, though, shows that the church and political authorities have long tried to control who marries whom, particularly the marriages of those who have any money or power. The lower castes and peasantry could just go and jump over a broom or the like. Not only is marriage potentially political, so is love. The commitment of love can threaten regimes who want our first allegiance to be to them, or to their allowed categories for love. You may recall that it is likely the lovers in that biblical book, the Song of Songs, controversially biblical book, those lovers were probably from different classes or races, and they therefore tried to hide their love. As the Women's Bible Commentary says, the Song of Songs insists in a rather dramatic manner on a man's and woman's right to love whomever their heart chooses, irrespective of prevailing cultural norms. It is the St Valentine's text. The inclusion of the book in the Bible, it could be argued, gives a form of precedence or legitimacy to love beyond the boundaries imposed by the powerful. Back to Valentine. Back to the legends. In some accounts, the unsanctioned marriages he performed, the ones that got him in trouble, were unsanctioned because allegedly marriage exempted men from being required to serve in the Roman legions, the army. And similarly, in other accounts, those marriages were unsanctioned because Emperor Claudius believed that married men were less inclined to join his wars of conquest, all of which may or may not have been true. But regardless, the thread of these stories is that Valentine broke the rules about who could marry whom. which nowadays you would think could encourage Christian ministers to officiate at weddings of same-sex couples. Not that you'd lose your head like St Valentine if you got caught, just your job. Valentine's Saint's Day, the day of his execution, was February the 14th, 269 CE. Of course, somewhat like St Nicholas, St Valentine has, without his consent, supported a vast industry, selling cards, roses, gifts, and dinners out. The mythology, as mythologies do, has evolved, so that February the 14th is seen as a celebration of romantic love, rather than the risk-taking love of a minister who put the will and needs of couples above the will and needs of the authorities. As our first reading today, we heard Edward Lear's memorable The Owl and the Pussycat. And hopefully it brought a smile to people's faces. It's a somewhat absurd, somewhat quaint, and somewhat fun poem. But it is also, on closer inspection, whether intended by Lear or not, points to something more than just romantic love. Think about the poem for a minute. There's a fundamental difference between the two lovers. Not just race, culture, or class, but species, an owl and a pussycat. Really? Wouldn't one just eat the other? And what, pray tell, would their children look like? And where would they live? Etc., etc. Maybe it's no accident that they went to sea, running away from the eyes and voices and anger of criticism. Is it any wonder that their resources are minimal, that their ring is second-hand, from a pig's nose no less, and they sailed away for a whole year and a day, and their families do not appear at their wedding? They sound like migrants or asylum seekers, or a couple fleeing before the wrath of their society. That's the thing about love, the thing we need to remember, and the thing we need to tell our young. There is often great joy in love, great meaning in love, but there's often great cost, great sacrifice. For love encompasses the wonder of deep contentment and well-being, but it also encompasses the grittiness, the perseverance of commitment. Love is about the fulfillment of self, of nurture, encouragement, comfort. But it's also about the giving or losing of the self when and where the other is prioritized, which sometimes comes easily and sometimes not. Love frequently grows, blooms, and perfumes the relationship with joy. But love is also about change, seemingly constant change, through all the seasons of existence and what those seasons demand of and offer to us. So love is a journey, but maybe not quite as dramatic as the owls and the pussycats. In the context of our theme of love, there are three things I'd like to point out from our second reading today, which is Luke's Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6. Firstly, it begins with not with words, from Jesus, but actions. Actions of healing and helping, being with those suffering. It begins with expressing kindness by what we do rather than by what we say. Right at the beginning, it's heralding that love is concrete and specific. Secondly, each of Luke's Beatitudes addresses an unmistakably literal situation. Blessed are you who are poor, in verse 20, sets the tone. Then come words of hope to those who are hungry, who mourn, who are hated and excluded. Each will receive the thing they lack, or perhaps already have. There is no responsible way to read these as about anything other than what they seem to mean: material need and a promise of reversal. Of course, these Beatitudes do include interior feelings, experiences of loss and exclusion, as well as the economic circumstances. But it's quite different from Matthew. This beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, which is often taken to mean not referring to economic circumstances. And thirdly, I'd like to point out there is an implicit challenge in that text from Luke 6 to those of us who aren't poor, hungry, mourning, hated, and or excluded. That challenge is to help individuals change the circumstances to lead to their poverty and suffering, and above all show the kindness that is the lifeblood of our faith. I read a very powerful piece by the late John O'Donoghue this week. It's about kindness, the kindness that dwells deep down, the kindness that is the bedrock of hope. I'd like now to slowly and meditatively read it to you. It comes from, just find the reference, it comes from his Benedictus, a book of blessings. There is a kindness that dwells deep down in things. It presides everywhere, often in places we least expect. The world can be harsh and negative, but if we remain generous and patient, kindness inevitably reveals itself. Something deep in the human soul seems to depend on the presence of kindness. Something instinctive in us expects us. And once we sense it, we're able to trust and open ourselves. The word kindness has a gentle sound, which seems to echo the presence of compassionate goodness. When someone is kind, you feel understood and seen. There is no judgment or harsh perception directed towards you. Kindness has gracious eyes. It's not small-minded or competitive. It wants nothing back for itself. Kindness strikes a resonance with the depths of your own heart. It also suggests that your vulnerability, though somehow exposed, is not taken advantage of. Rather, it has become an occasion of dignity and empathy. Kindness casts a different light, an evening light, that has the depth of colour and patience to illuminate what is complex and rich in difference. Despite all the darkness, human hope is based on the instinct that at the deepest level of reality, some intimate kindness holds sway. Blessings to you this week.